Menger focuses on money to illustrate his theory on the evolutionary emergence of social institutions. He applies his theory to the emergence and evolution of money, though he expressly states that the same theory can also be applied to explain the emergence of all the other institutions that make life in society possible.
¿Cómo explica el surgimiento del...
How does Menger explain the emergence of money? Well, as the result of a process he calls organic. He is still using somewhat unsuitable terminology. In other words, an evolutionary process in which many human beings participate and in which the institution almost miraculously emerges without any prediction from the participants in the process that money would emerge, nor any deliberate pursuit of its emergence. The emergence of money is easy to understand. To begin, we must step back and imagine the world in the stage before money emerged. Exchanges took place in that stage without a doubt, but they were direct exchanges, barter transactions. And bartering poses a fundamental problem, that of the double coincidence of wants. We already know that for any exchange to take place, each party must attach a higher subjective value to what he lacks and the other party has than to what he has and expects to give in the exchange. But direct exchanges require that the other party have precisely what I need, and particularly value, and vice versa. That by some coincidence I have available to me something the other party values.
Y eso es lo que se llama el problema de la...
That is called the problem of the double coincidence of wants. Imagine how very complicated it would be from a commercial standpoint to close a deal if there were no medium of exchange. For example, I would offer my services as an economics professor, because that is what I know and can do. However, my needs are for food and suits, etc. Does any of you have a grocery store or a supermarket? No one. Does any of you have a tailor's shop or a clothing store? No again. Well, notice, if that is what I need, then we could not close a deal by bartering or direct exchange, because there is no double coincidence of wants.
Entonces, lo que queremos es...
My point is that since bartering or direct exchange requires as a precondition that each party have precisely what the other desires,
restringe enormemente el ámbito de los intercambios potenciales que pueden llevarse a cabo.
a society in which money does not exist is a society in which exchanges take place on a very small scale. It is a society in which it is impossible to expand the division of knowledge. It is a society in which there can be no advancement of civilization, no advancements in information and knowledge like the ones we are used to and take for granted in modern societies, in societies where money is used.
Entonces, históricamente, lo que explica Menger es un proceso...
So, historically speaking, Menger describes a process. He describes it in abstract theoretical terms, an evolutionary social process in which the leading role is played by anonymous, flesh and blood human beings. These people existed, and though we do not know their first and last names, they did civilization an invaluable service. Basically, we are all in debt to these men and women. In their specific circumstances of time and place, they managed to realize before anyone else that they better achieved their ends if, when they made exchanges, instead of asking for precisely what they needed, for goods they hoped to use as consumer goods or factors of production, because they needed them for their entrepreneurial projects, they asked for a good which they perceived or had discovered, at first intuitively, was a more frequent object of exchange. Something that changed hands more frequently in the historical context in which they lived. They realized that if they asked for the good which was most frequently exchanged in the environment in which they found themselves, it was then easier for them to find someone willing to give them precisely what they needed.
Y este bien que con más frecuencia se intercambie,
And that good which was most frequently exchanged varied from one set of historical circumstances to another. In ancient Egypt, since the swells of the Nile left both banks covered with fertile soil, the quintessential good was wheat or grain, and it was by far the good which changed hands most often. In ancient Mesopotamia, in contrast, the most common goods were head of cattle, or wine, sheep, goats, etc.
en otras circunstancias históricas, por ejemplo, en
In other historical circumstances, for example in Asia Minor, perhaps around Palestine, or in the area of the Philistines, what changed hands most were small pieces of metal. If we talk about Egypt, for example, we can imagine a hypothetical entrepreneur, a doctor, who worked in the age of the pharaohs, and who, in exchange for his services, asked for certain quantities of wheat. Not because he was going to consume them, but because he realized that with those quantities of wheat, it would later be easier for him to acquire the tools he needed, or the goods and services he needed for daily life. To the extent that this strategy was successful, the strategy of demanding in exchange for what one has, not a good one plans to consume, but rather a good to use later as a medium of exchange. Additional demand for the good in question, in this case wheat, as a medium of exchange, gradually began to overlap the traditional demand. And as this additional demand for the good as a medium of exchange progressively increased, a commonly and generally accepted medium of exchange, our theoretical or praxeological definition of money, emerged unnoticed, little by little.
luego la institución del dinero
So, the institution of money emerged as a result of the entrepreneurial alertness of a few people in the beginning, a vanguard of creative entrepreneurs who discovered that they better achieved their ends if, in exchange for what they had, they asked for a good they realized was more liquid, one that changed hands more frequently in the historical context in which they lived. And to the extent that this strategy was successful, the good was gradually tested, and a second wave of alert entrepreneurs copied the successful strategy of the first few, and so on. People gradually adopted the habit of requesting, in return for what they had, a medium of exchange, regardless of the form it took, and money emerged. A process driven by entrepreneurship was set in motion, and it tended to select as a medium of exchange, from all goods, the one which most frequently changed hands. In fact, since this good was easier to sell than the rest, it attracted additional demand, and when the process concluded, most of the demand for that good was due precisely to its use as a medium of exchange. Demand for it as a factor of production or consumed good became of secondary importance. Now, we all understand how a medium of exchange greatly facilitates exchanges. I am an economics professor, and my needs are for food and suits. And even if none of you has direct access to food or suits, if a medium of exchange exists, the problem is immediately resolved. You pay me in monetary units, and then, with those monetary units, though I cannot eat or wear the bills, it will be extraordinarily easy for me to find someone willing to provide me with what I need in exchange for money. This is how what we call indirect exchange emerged, and it permits an unlimited explosion of exchanges.